Story number 1. The Lost Train of Sierra Nevada. I bought a one-way ticket to Reno on a brisk December evening, hoping to outrun my ghosts. What I found instead was a train burdened by ghosts of its own. This is the story of how I boarded a nightmare on steel rails, how I glimpsed a world that shouldn't exist, locked in an endless loop of ice and regret. I boarded the night train from Sacramento just as dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. The Sierra Nevada mountains loomed ahead, dark outlines capped with early snows. A chill had settled on the platform, my breath puffed in small clouds. The old Amtrak train squealed as it pulled into the station. It looked ordinary enough, a diesel locomotive with a line of cars behind, fluorescent lights casting a warm glow in the windows. The conductor checked my ticket with a polite nod, and I found a seat in a half-empty coach near the back. It smelled of stale coffee and recycled air. A few other passengers were scattered about, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, a man in a rumpled suit typing furiously on a laptop, and a pair of college kids listening to music through shared earbuds. I settled by the window, gazing out as the train jerked forward. Street lights and station signs blurred into the darkness. The overhead speakers crackled with the conductor's announcement, we'd reach Reno by early morning if weather permitted. If not, well, the Sierra winter had a reputation for snarling travel plans. Outside, the sky darkened to black. I sank deeper into my seat, lulled by the train's gentle rocking, oblivious to the fact that nothing about this journey would be gentle. About an hour into the trip, the train began winding into the foothills. Pine trees crowded the track, their branches frosted with snow. Occasionally, a crossing signal flashed in the distance, or a lonely house's lights flickered through the tree-line. The rattle of the rails was steady, almost comforting. I was dozing off when the overhead lights in the car began to flicker. My eyes snapped open. The rumpled suit man cursed under his breath as his laptop screen dimmed. The college kids looked up from their phone, puzzled. Then the lights stabilized. Everything returned to normal, or so it seemed. Until I noticed a man sitting across from me. He was old, with thin white hair combed back, wearing a heavy wool overcoat and a battered hat resting on the seat beside him. His eyes were a striking pale gray, almost colorless, and he had them fixed on me as if studying my face. I forced a polite smile, unsettled by his intensity. He acknowledged me with a slow nod. We sat like that for a moment, two strangers on a train, the silence between us muffled by the hum of travel. Then, quietly, he spoke. "Storm's coming," he said. His voice was low, rough like gravel. "They say it'll be a big one." I nodded. "So I've heard. Hard to predict the weather in these mountains." He smiled faintly. "Not so hard. These peaks have their own ways, especially around this time of year." Before I could respond, the train lurched into a tunnel, plunging us into a brief darkness. The lights flickered again, and a hush fell over the car. I felt an odd prickle at the back of my neck. When we emerged, the overhead fluorescence returned, and everything looked the same, except the old man's smile had faded. He was staring out the window now, eyes distant, as if seeing something far beyond the snow. We crossed into higher altitudes, the temperature plummeting outside. Snow battered the windows in diagonal streaks. The conductor passed through the car, quietly checking on passengers, then moved on. The cabin's heater hummed, but the seats near the windows were cold enough that I kept my jacket on. The flickers in the lights came more frequently, a brief stutter every few minutes, as though the train's power was struggling under the storm's onslaught. I tried to read a paperback I'd brought, but I couldn't focus. My gaze kept drifting to the old man. Eventually, he must have felt my eyes on him, because he turned. "You're headed to Reno," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. "You got family there, or business?" I shrugged. "Family, sort of. Looking for a fresh start, actually." "And you?" He tapped his cane on the floor. "Ain't got family anymore. Not traveling far. Might get off before Reno if the train lets me." His lips curled in a wry grin, as if he'd told a private joke. Curiosity stirred in me. "If the train lets you?" His gaze flicked to the overhead lights, which fluttered in response. Strange things happen in these mountains. Folks say there's a ghost train that wanders the old tracks. A relic from the 1800s, back when the railroad through the Sierra was first built. Rumor is, a rockslide buried it in an avalanche. Killed everyone on board, never found the wreck. They say on cold winter nights, you might see that train appear on the rails. Might even mistake it for your own ride, if you're not careful. A chill laced his words, and my stomach tensed. I forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. I've heard stories like that. Urban legends. Some legends are real, he replied softly. I glanced around at the other passengers, but they seemed untroubled. A few were dozing, lulled by the train's motion, or absorbed in phones. The old man's words clung to me like frost, and I couldn't help but notice, for the first time, that the fluorescent glow behind him didn't cast his shadow on the floor. The train rattled on through the night. The next time the lights blinked out, it lasted a fraction longer. I felt the floor vibrate in an odd stutter, as though the rails themselves were momentarily uncertain. When illumination returned, the rumpled suit man cursed again, hitting his laptop. The college kids exchanged uneasy glances. And me? My pulse quickened. Something about the old man's story, combined with the flickering lights, gnawed at my nerves. Outside, the snow thickened. We barreled deeper into the Sierra, the slope growing steeper, the trees whirling past like ghostly sentinels. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing an upcoming switchback tunnel and a possible delay due to the weather. I sighed, leaning my head against the cold window, the glass fogging with my breath. That's when the old man's voice piped up again, so soft I almost didn't hear it. "It's near," he said. I turned. "What is?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he locked those pale eyes on mine. "Promise me one thing, when the train stops, don't get off. No matter what you see or hear, stay in your seat." A cold thread of fear wrapped around my chest. Why would I get off in the middle of nowhere? He opened his mouth, about to reply, but the train lurched violently to one side. People cried out. Bags slid off overhead racks. I grabbed the seat to steady myself. The rumpled suit man nearly toppled over. The cabin lights blinked, then died. For a moment, darkness swallowed everything but the snow-lashed windows. The train slowed, wheels screeching, until we came to a stop. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing the corridor in a dim orange glow. The wind howled outside, and the snow battered the glass like a million fingernails scratching to get in. We'd come to rest in a tunnel. Or so the conductor announced when he passed by, shining a flashlight down the aisle. The storm was too fierce, and dispatch wanted us to wait out the worst of it before proceeding. Everyone muttered or groaned, but there was little to do but accept it. The old man across from me stared out the window again. But now, the window revealed only darkness. The tunnel's walls pressed close on either side, thick with shadow, no sign of snow or trees. Just blackness. I tried to distract myself by reading, but the hush weighed on me. Finally, I spoke. "Tell me more about that ghost train. The one lost in an avalanche." He parted his thin lips, exhaling slowly. "Happened in the 1880s. A passenger train, steam-driven, carrying gold prospectors, families, and mail. They were crossing the Sierra during a snowstorm. The record said an avalanche roared down the mountain, burying the tracks. The engine, the cars, everything vanished under tons of ice and snow. No survivors. Some say it was the railroad's fault, ignoring avalanche warnings for profit. Others blamed the mountains themselves, said they wanted a sacrifice. And some say the train still roams the rails on winter nights, searching for a station that no longer exists." He paused, glancing at the other passengers dozing or scrolling through phones. "Those who see it often don't come back." My skin prickled. "But that's just a legend, right?" He gave a half-smile that held no warmth. "Is it?" I steadied him, a question tugging at my mind. "What's your name?" His eyes flicked back to me. "Names aren't important. But if you must call me something." "Henry." "Henry, do you ride this train often?" His smile thinned. "You might say that." Then, with a quiet sigh, he lifted his hat, placing it on his head. Only then did I realize the seat behind him was empty of any reflection or shadow. My heart hammered. I forced myself to look away, telling myself it was just the weird angles of the emergency lighting. But a gnawing voice inside whispered, "He has no shadow." We sat in that tunnel for an hour, maybe two. Time lost its meaning in the half-dark. The conductor occasionally marched by, murmuring about the storm. The passengers grumbled. The rumpled suit man threatened to sue Amtrak for delays. The college kids yawned. We all waited. Eventually, with a jolt, the train started moving again, inching forward through the tunnel. The overhead lights flickered back to life, though dimmer than before, and the heater resumed its low hum. A collective sigh of relief spread through the car. We emerged from the tunnel into a landscape transformed by the storm, drifts of snow blanketing the tracks, pine boughs sagging under the weight, the moon a silver disk behind swirling clouds. It was beautiful, but ominous, like stepping into a dream where everything was hushed and expectant. Henry watched me with a sympathetic tilt to his head. "Remember what I said. No matter what happens, stay on board." His words set me on edge. I looked out the window at the swirling snow, my reflection pale in the glass. What if the train stops again? He didn't answer, just tapped his cane softly on the floor, eyes drifting to the corridor leading to the next car. They can be persuasive. They? Again, no answer. The train picked up speed. The rumpled suit man dozed, head lolling. The college kids were half asleep, their phone battery drained. The middle-aged woman with tired eyes had vanished, maybe to the restroom or another car. Henry remained awake, posture rigid, glancing occasionally out the window as though searching for something. Or someone. Suddenly, the lights dimmed once more. A static crackle hissed from the overhead speakers. In the corridor, a shape flickered, a silhouette in old-fashioned attire, gone in an eye blink. My heart pounded. Maybe my eyes played tricks. But Henry turned, following my gaze, and nodded grimly. A few moments later, we heard it, a mournful whistle echoing from behind us. Not the modern horn of our diesel locomotive, but a classic steam whistle from decades past. The hairs on my arms prickled. The conductor at the front of the car froze, his face puzzled. He picked up his radio, spoke into it, but no reply came. The train's speed dropped abruptly, wheels screeching, as though the brakes engaged. We weren't near a station, just a stretch of track bordered by cliffs and pines. Outside, the wind moaned. The overhead lights flickered and died, replaced by emergency lights again. The passengers stirred, uncertain. Fear glimmered in their eyes. Then came the hiss of steam, so loud it drowned the wind. The cabin door at the back of the car slid open, and a chill wind gusted through, swirling snow into the aisle. In the swirling flurry, I glimpsed a different car beyond, wood-paneled walls, glowing lanterns, passengers in 19th century garb. They stared at us with hollow eyes. I gasped, stumbling backward, nearly colliding with Henry's seat. The others in my car cried out, confusion turning to panic. The 19th century passengers stepped forward, drifting across the threshold as though bridging two times at once. Their expressions were solemn, their forms faintly translucent in the emergency lights. One of them, a woman in a tattered dress, reached out a hand. Her lips moved, though I heard no voice. Another, a mustached man in a bowler hat, locked eyes with me. Despite the gloom, I saw sorrow etched on his face. They parted to form a path. And behind them, in that ghostly train car, I saw a swirl of steam and the shadowy outline of a locomotive that didn't belong to this era. The cables and wiring of our modern train vanished in that space, replaced by wrought iron fittings and oil lamps. A phantom platform? The conductor from our world tried to interject, shouting, "What's going on? Everyone stay calm." But his words were lost in the hiss of steam, in the low moan of the wind. The ghostly figures advanced. The rumpled suit man cried out, tried to run, but found the corridor blocked by a tall, spectral miner whose face was half caved in by some old injury. The man dropped to his knees, sobbing. I saw the college kids clinging to each other, their eyes wide with terror. The middle-aged woman was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she had fled to another car. Henry rose from his seat. Don't go, he warned me, voice firm. They want us to join them. But we can resist. I found my feet edging forward, almost involuntarily, as though pulled by an unseen force. The ghostly passengers beckoned. In my ears, 1,000 voices whispered, "Help us, join us, come with us." Each syllable pricked my mind like static. I fought the compulsion, nails digging into my palms. The entire train seemed suspended in a bubble of silence, except for the hiss of steam and that lonely whistle far off in the storm. Henry placed a hand on my shoulder. "Fight it," he said urgently. "They need living souls to break their eternal loop. If you go, you'll never leave." "Why me?" I managed, my throat tight. He just shook his head. "They'll take anyone they can." Around us, more ghostly figures poured in from that impossible carriage, children with solemn eyes, prospectors in dirt-stained clothes, railroad men with lanterns. Each wore an expression of longing. Then, amidst them, a figure stepped forward, a tall conductor from another century, uniform caked in grime, face drawn and pale. He lifted a ghostly watch from his pocket, gazing at it with frustration, then pinned me with a dead-eyed stare. He extended his gloved hand, palm up, as if inviting me to place my hand in his. My heart thudded. I sensed his desperation, decades, centuries spent wandering, seeking an escape from the avalanche that never ended, from the tomb of ice that bound them. I almost relented. My foot slid forward an inch, and in that moment, a vision assaulted me, a snowslide roaring down a gorge, screams cut short as the train tumbled into the white darkness, souls trapped beneath crushing weight, still traveling those rails in an endless search for peace. The horror of it nearly broke me. At the last second, Henry grabbed my wrist. "No." Everything fell still. The ghosts waited, silent. The conductor's expression changed from sorrow to something else, anger, maybe. In unison, the spectral passengers advanced, arms reaching for my shoulders, my face, my heart. The temperature plummeted further, my breath freezing in midair. The train walls behind them flickered, jumping between our modern steel interior and the rotted wooden boards of 1880-something. Henry stepped between me and them. "You can't have this one," he said, voice trembling yet defiant. "He's not yours to take." A wave of unimaginable cold rippled through the car, emanating from the ghosts. The overhead speakers emitted a screech of static, and I heard 1,000 voices moan in unison, resonating with the train's frame. The windows shook violently. Outside, snow pelted the glass, forming intricate webs of frost. My vision swam. I felt my heartbeat slow, as if time itself were freezing. Henry's voice sounded distant. "Stay with me. Fight them." I clenched my teeth. With every ounce of will, I yanked my gaze from the ghosts, turned, and stumbled toward the front of the car. The corridor was a chaos of swirling snow and flickering lights. Shadows loomed at the edges of my vision, trying to lure me into the phantom carriage. I pressed on, Henry right behind me, urging me not to stop. The forward cars of the train were in disarray. Some passengers were missing. Doors hung open, letting gusts of icy wind swirl snow down the aisles. As we half ran, half stumbled, ghostly apparitions flickered in corners and reflections, each one a soul from that lost train. Finally, we reached the locomotive cabin. The modern engineer was there, in shock, radio crackling with static. "I can't explain it," he stammered, eyes darting around. One minute, we're on the main line. The next, all instruments went haywire. The rails, they vanished. Henry shoved me behind him, confronting the engineer. "We have to move forward. Don't stop, no matter what. Get us off this line." The engineer looked at him as if he were insane. But there's no line to follow." Henry pointed at the throttle. "It's an illusion. Just drive. The real track is still there. This is their domain, the ghosts are trying to derail us." The engineer hesitated, then yanked a lever. The locomotive roared, wheels spinning on slick rails. For a moment, we didn't move. Then, slowly, the train lurched forward, the engine straining. A deafening roar filled my ears, as though the air itself was tearing open. I risked a glance through the windshield. Snow whited out everything, but beyond that, I glimpsed something. A twisted, half-collapsed trestle? Rock walls? The ghost train? It flickered. One moment, I saw the phantom rails, broken and half-buried in snow from a century ago. The next, our modern track cut through the pass. We were straddling two realities, locked in a battle of existence. The air tasted of electricity. My vision blurred with tears, my heart straining. The train's wheels found traction. We surged ahead. The ghosts outside howled in anger, or was it despair? Through the swirling snow, I saw the phantom conductor standing on the side, arms raised as if cursing us to remain. Ghostly passengers reached out, eyes hollow. The storm's roar intensified, a tidal wave of white. My ears popped. My mind reeled. Then, with an almost physical snap, we broke through. The storm parted, replaced by the serene hush of a snowfall on modern rails. The phantom train, the ghostly figures, they were gone. Our locomotive rumbled steadily, the track beneath us real and solid. The overhead lights brightened. The heater kicked back on. Our world returned. I collapsed onto a seat, breath ragged. The engineer stared in shock at the instruments, which now displayed normal readings. Henry stood, silent, by the doorway. The tension in his frame eased as he let out a slow breath. We'd escaped. The rest of the journey to Reno passed in a daze. The storm calmed just enough for a safe, albeit delayed, arrival. As the passengers disembarked, I saw the rumpled suit man among them, eyes haunted, refusing to speak of what he'd witnessed. The college kids clutched each other, pale as death, hurriedly vanishing into the station. The middle-aged woman was never found. The conductor insisted she must have gotten off earlier, but we hadn't stopped. That's when I understood some had been taken. As for Henry, the moment I stepped onto the platform, I turned to thank him, ask him how he knew so much. But he was gone. No sign of him among the departing passengers. An impossible chill gnawed at me. Could he have been one of them, a spirit caught between worlds, trying to save others from his fate? A few bystanders, oblivious to the night's horrors, smiled politely at me in the station. I smiled back, but I felt no warmth. I carried the memory of those ghostly faces, their sorrowful eyes, and Henry's warning. They had wanted me to join them, to vanish into that timeless winter. I still heard the faint echoes of the phantom locomotive's whistle in my mind. I never took that route by night again. Some things are better left unseen, unchallenged. But I can't forget what I saw, or the hush of the Sierra storm that nearly claimed me. Sometimes, late at night, I lie awake and recall Henry's final words. Remember what I said. No matter what you see or hear, don't leave the train. If you ever find yourself on a winter's night train through the Sierra Nevada, keep that advice close to your heart. Because there's a lost locomotive out there on the old rails, a ghost train buried by an avalanche more than a century ago. And sometimes, on cold nights, it crosses paths with the living, searching for passengers to fill its empty seats. So if the lights flicker, if you glimpse a face in old-time clothes, or if a stranger warns you not to disembark, listen. The ghosts of the Sierra might only need one moment of doubt, one hesitation, to snatch you away into an eternal journey of snow and sorrow. And once you step onto that cursed train, there's no coming back. Story number 2. Voices in the Desert. I've spent most of my life around trains. My father was a brakeman on the lines running north from Barstow, and my mother used to pack his lunch pail with a loving note every morning. When I was a kid, I thought I'd do just about anything other than follow in his footsteps. But here I am now, a grown man working the night shift as a rail worker on a freight run through the Mojave Desert, a place known for its scorching days, frigid nights, and more than a few unsettling legends. You wouldn't believe how quiet the desert can be at midnight, once the engine's roar has slipped into a steady hum. That hush has a way of making the old stories real. And out there, under a moon brittle as bone, I learned the Mojave can hide horrors you never want to meet. It all started on a Tuesday in mid-December, the kind of night so clear you could count 1,000 stars just by lifting your gaze. But the chill? It cut straight through to my bones. The Mojave might be a furnace by day, but once the sun sets, the temperature plunges. You can feel it creeping in, gnawing your fingertips, burrowing into your lungs with each breath. I was stationed on a long freight train hauling cargo from Barstow toward the state line, eventually bound for Reno. My job was mostly routine: check the couplings, keep an eye on the load, monitor for any mechanical issues. Some nights are so monotonous you want to scream just to hear an echo. But not that night. That night was anything but dull. Our train was a modern behemoth, a long snake of boxcars, container flats, and tanker cars clanging in the dark. We had a crew of 3, an engineer, a conductor, and me, the roving worker who hopped between cars. The track lay before us, a silver line vanishing into blackness. I remember thinking, just one more shift, then I can crash in a motel bed and forget the desert. I didn't know that was the last peaceful thought I'd have for a while. We'd been rolling a couple of hours past sundown. The train's spotlight pierced the desert gloom, revealing clusters of cacti, distant rocky outcrops, and sometimes the glow of a distant highway. The engine's rumble provided a comforting background. I hopped down from my vantage point in the lead locomotive to walk the length of the train, part of my standard check. I remember the air was so cold my breath plumed in front of me, and the rails sparkled under the moonlight. I started down the narrow catwalk on the side of the boxcars, shining a flashlight on hoses and couplers. All was normal, until I thought I heard something, a faint hum, like someone humming a tune I couldn't quite place. I paused, flashlight raised. The cargo cars were locked, sealed with steel bolts. No passengers aboard, obviously. This was a freight run. The sound seemed to come from one of the middle boxcars, though. A lilting melody, soft and distant, drifting on the cold wind. My heartbeat quickened as I pressed my ear to the side of the car. Could it be the metal echoing? Some quirk of the wind? I heard it again. So quiet, like a group of voices or maybe one voice layered on itself. It sent goosebumps prickling across my arms. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the desert playing tricks. The Mojave is known for illusions. After all, the ancient volcanic rock, the dryness, the extremes of temperature can do odd things to your senses. Trying to dismiss it, I continued my check, resolved to report the anomaly when I got back to the cab. But the next time the wind gusted, I swore I heard words in the singing, though not in any language I knew. More moan, a lament carried by the rails. I quickened my pace, my mind spinning. If I didn't know better, I'd say that's singing. But that made no sense. No sense at all. When I returned to the cab, the engineer, whose name was Danny, was flipping switches, scanning dials, while the conductor, Robert, sipped coffee from a dented thermos. They glanced up as I climbed in. "You look spooked," Robert said, arching an eyebrow. I hesitated. Could have sworn I heard singing or humming near the middle of the train. They exchanged looks. Danny shrugged. The desert does weird stuff to acoustics. Or maybe it's air in the brake lines. I hear squeals all the time that sound like voices. It's normal. Sure, I muttered, rubbing warmth back into my gloved hands. Just wanted to mention it. We let it drop. But the rest of the ride, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Outside, the night pressed in, infinite and cold. The track stretched on, cutting across miles of bleak desert. The train rumbled. The wind howled. And my thoughts kept returning to that strange tune. We made decent time. By 2 a.m., we were approaching a seldom-used section of track that locals called the Ghost Bypass. No one could tell me why, exactly, some old rumor about wrecks or sabotage from the gold rush era. The railway higher-ups didn't talk about it. But the track was official, part of the route. That was all that mattered, right? We switched lines onto the bypass. The rails groaned under the weight. In the distance, I could see the silhouettes of rugged hills beneath the moonlight. The train's progress slowed slightly as we tackled a mild grade. I exhaled, closing my eyes for a minute. Then a buzzer beeped in the cab, indicating a motion sensor triggered on car number 14. Robert cursed. Damn it, what now? The sensor was brand new, installed to detect break-ins or shifting cargo. Usually, it tripped if the door jostled loose or a heavy box tumbled inside. But we'd loaded car number 14 with sealed crates, nothing that should shift dangerously. And no one was supposed to be inside, obviously. I grabbed my flashlight again. I'll check it out. Despite my outward show of calm, my stomach knotted. Could that singing? Need me to come along? Robert asked, looking uneasy. Nah, keep an eye on the controls. I'll radio if it's something weird. The engineer gave me a quick nod. I forced a grin I didn't feel and stepped back into the dark corridor leading to the locomotive's rear door. The train swayed gently, metal wheels clacking over rail joints. My heart hammered as I climbed between cars, heading toward number 14. The wind outside was fiercer now. Gusts whipped at my jacket, nearly knocking me off balance. I moved from car to car, stepping carefully on the metal platforms between them. My breath stung in my throat. Ahead, the faint glow of the train's safety lights illuminated a wedge of darkness. Finally, I reached car number 14. The chain latch was in place, but the sensor panel near the door glowed red. Something inside was moving, or at least, the system believed so. I shivered, unlatching the door carefully. The moment I cracked it open, a rush of frigid air blasted out, colder than the desert night. My flashlight beam scanned the interior. Stacks of wooden crates lined the car's walls, secured by straps. The corridor down the middle was narrow, with only a few feet of space. Everything looked normal, except for the frost rimming the inside corners, as if the temperature had plunged within. My breath plumed in thick clouds. What the hell? I stepped inside. The door slid shut behind me, the darkness swallowing me in a hush. The train's rumble felt distant, as if I'd entered a sealed chamber. Slowly, I swept the flashlight around. The crates were stenciled with shipping labels from a mining supply company. The straps were intact, none obviously broken. Yet something felt profoundly wrong. Then I heard it, soft singing, like a lullaby echoing in a church. The hair on my neck stood up. It seemed to come from deeper in the car. I advanced, forcing each step, my pulse pounding in my ears. Halfway down, I found footprints in a thin layer of dust. Footprints that led to the far corner. My heart hammered. No living person should be in here. I nudged my radio. Robert, you read me? I'm in number 14. Something's definitely weird. Static hissed back at me, faint and distorted. I caught a single word, careful, before the connection died. I followed the footprints to the back of the car. The singing grew louder, a gentle chorus that shouldn't exist in a sealed cargo hold. My flashlight flicked across a crate labeled handle with care, but my attention snapped to movement behind it. Shapes. Human silhouettes, faint and colorless, as though lit from within by a pale glow. They sat on crates as if they were benches, gazing ahead, unmoving. My mind reeled, insisting I must be hallucinating. Yet there they were, maybe half a dozen figures, men and women, their clothes outdated by a century or more. A swirl of ragged skirts, dusty boots, battered hats. Their faces were blank, expressionless, eyes fixed on me. The singing crescendoed, though none of their lips moved. In unison, they turned their heads, slow and jerky, to stare right at me. My flashlight flickered, threatened to die. My body froze in terror. This can't be real. But it was. One figure, a woman with stringy hair, raised a hand, beckoning me closer. I tried to back away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The corners of her mouth curved up in a smile that was all wrong, too wide, too empty. My vision swam as their voices merged into a single note that vibrated in my skull. Then, abruptly, they vanished. Just gone, leaving the crates behind. The singing cut off mid-note. I staggered back, heart thundering, flashlight trembling. The interior was silent except for the clanking of wheels and the hiss of the train's brake lines. The footprints in the dust remained. I stumbled out of car number 14, slamming the door behind me and relatching it. My radio crackled. "Jake, you okay?" "Reading spikes in your location," came Robert's distant voice. I pressed the button, breath ragged, but couldn't form words. Finally, I managed, "Yeah, just get me a minute." I needed to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. The train soared on, slicing through the desert night. I forced myself to keep going, searching for any sign that might explain these apparitions. Maybe an old door had swung open, letting in a swirl of dust that played tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew better. One car over was the crew bunk area, mostly used on longer runs. It had a small desk, a bare bunk, and a battered old trunk for supplies. I'd never had reason to open the trunk until that moment. But something, call it desperation, pushed me to rummage through it. Inside, I found a law book, stained with coffee or oil. The cover read, Property of E. Harrigan, 1982. I flipped it open, scanning entries. It seemed to be the notes of a rail worker who'd manned this route decades ago. Toward the back, words jumped out at me. Saw them again last night. Shadows in the freight car. They sang, tried to lure me in. I warned the next shift, don't watch them too long. They'll keep you forever. My blood chilled. Another line read. They say these spirits belong to travelers from the 1800s, trapped by curses or unfinished business. Some think it's the desert, punishing greed. Others say it's a distortion in time. All I know is, if you see them, look away. Do not engage. I slammed the law book shut, hands shaking. So this had happened before. The dread in my gut deepened. Don't watch them. They will keep you. Armed with the law book's warning, I made my way back to the locomotive. Robert's eyes widened as I entered, and Danny frowned. You look like death, man. I took a shaky breath, recounted what happened, the singing, the apparitions. I showed them the law book. Danny's skepticism melted as I described the voices. Robert kept glancing at the instrumentation, which flickered with random spikes. The data read bizarre temperature drops in the middle cars, like pockets of intense cold. We decided we had to keep going. Stopping in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal, in a region rumored to be haunted, was unthinkable. Our plan, pushed to the next yard, a small rail outpost near the state line, about 40 miles ahead. Then we'd secure the train on a sidetrack and get the hell out. That was the plan, anyway. Barely half an hour later, the train lurched violently. The entire consist shuddered as though something massive had slammed into it from the side. Alarms beeped, lights flickered. We nearly derailed, but Danny fought the controls, keeping us upright. The speed dropped dangerously, the wheels screeching. Then, inexplicably, the momentum returned, and we chugged forward at a crawl. When the chaos settled, an emergency alert pinged. Car number 14 again. This time, it signaled that the door was open. That was impossible, I'd latched it. Robert and I exchanged a frantic look. We can't keep ignoring it, he said. If the door's open, cargo could be spilling out. I dreaded returning to that car, but we had no choice. We needed to secure the load. The desert was a dark blur outside, the train inching along, squealing in protest. I swallowed my fear, nodded. Let's do it, but we go together. We armed ourselves with flashlights and crowbars, more for comfort than practicality, and made our way down the line. The temperature was even lower now, the wind punishing. Each time we passed between cars, we felt like we'd be blown off the walkway into the desert night. Arriving at number 14, we found the door slid wide open, rattling in the wind. Inside, that same bone-chilling cold, thick enough to make our breath freeze midair. Robert gritted his teeth. We lock it up and run, yeah? Yeah, I whispered. We climbed in. The interior was darker than before. Our flashlights illuminated swirling dust and crates. The footprints were gone, replaced by a swirl of scuff marks in the dust, as though many feet had moved around. My heart hammered. They're in here again. The singing started, so faint I almost thought it was my imagination. Robert tensed. We pressed on, determined to slam the door shut from inside, then exit through the opposite side. As we reached the back half of the car, a cluster of shapes emerged from the shadows. Ghostly silhouettes, seated in rows, gazing at us with unearthly calm. The faint glow from their forms cast eerie streaks of light across the crates. They wore old-fashioned clothing, wide-brimmed hats, dusty bonnets, tattered waistcoats. Their eyes flickered with a milky luminescence. They sang a mournful tune, each voice weaving into a chord of despair. I felt a pull, an urge to stare into their eyes. Robert dropped his crowbar, slack-jawed, as if transfixed. Alarmed, I reached out to shake him. "No, don't." But the figures rose, arms extending. The woman I'd seen earlier among them locked her gaze on Robert, her expression hungry. I remembered the law book's words. Don't watch them too long. So I tore my eyes away, focusing instead on the floor, the crates, anywhere but them. I tugged on Robert, who seemed lost in a trance. He moaned softly. "They want me to come with them." "I see," his voice trailed off, eyes distant. "They'll keep you," I hissed. "We have to go." Gathering my courage, I forced myself to face them. Not directly, but out of the corner of my vision. The singing swelled. My chest felt tight. Summoning every ounce of will, I shoved Robert behind me and swung the crowbar in a wide arc, as if to ward them off. The metal passed through the air, meeting no resistance, but the ghostly shapes recoiled slightly, flickering. Robert blinked, regaining some clarity. "What?" "No time," I snapped. "Follow me. Don't look at them." We half stumbled, half charged to the door on the opposite side. The ghostly crowd drifted behind, their murmurings intensifying. As Robert and I vaulted over the threshold, I grabbed the door, sliding it shut with a clang. Then I spun the latch with shaking hands. Outside on the catwalk, we panted, hearts racing. The singing grew muffled behind the steel door, but we both felt it thrumming in our chests. We scrambled to the next car, continuing forward until we found ourselves back in the open air near the locomotive, the desert wind lashing us. We rejoined Danny in the cab, breathless. He took one look at our pale faces and knew something was very wrong. Without waiting for explanations, he throttled up, determined to escape this cursed stretch of track. That's when the engine coughed. The entire locomotive shuddered. Alarms beeped on the console. "What the hell?" Danny muttered, flicking switches. The train began to slow, our momentum dying. Through the windshield, we saw only swirling dust and darkness. The overhead light in the cab flickered ominously. A deep dread crawled up my spine. The ghosts didn't want us leaving. They'd found a way to drain the train's life. We ground to a halt. Silence enveloped us, broken only by the wind's howl. The conductor attempted to radio for help, but static answered. Robert slumped into a seat, face pale, still reeling from the encounter. Danny cursed, stepping outside to check the engine compartments. I followed him, though every nerve screamed to stay indoors. The desert was unbelievably cold. Our flashlights revealed the locomotive's external panels frosted over, the electronics seemingly shorted out. As Danny fiddled with wires, I heard footsteps crunching in the gravel behind us. We turned, flashlights raised. Nothing there. But a voice whispered, carried on the wind, "Come to us." We hurried back into the cab. "We have to separate," Danny said. "I'll try to fix the engine from inside. You two keep watch, make sure nothing out of the ordinary happens." Robert nodded weakly. The overhead speaker hissed, then a static-laced voice said, "Passengers, please remain seated." My stomach lurched. This train had no passenger announcements, only a freight crew system. The ghostly voice repeated the command, dripping with malice. I realized the ghosts had more control than we thought. The train might be physically stuck, but the presence was all around us, weaving through the electronics, the air, everything. If they lured us out one by one, we'd be doomed. We retreated to the car behind the locomotive, which functioned as a mini lounge. A few seats, a small table. The lights flickered. Robert looked at me, desperation in his eyes. "What do we do?" I remembered the law book's mention of unfinished business and time distortions. Maybe if we resisted, forced the train to keep going, we'd break free. Or maybe the ghosts just needed new souls to add to their haunting. I was no expert, just a terrified rail worker in a nightmare. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the lounge slid open. A swirl of icy air rushed in. Beyond it, I saw them again, the ghostly figures standing in the corridor, faces pale, eyes gleaming. They advanced silently, singing that mournful tune. My heart hammered, and Robert whimpered, backing away. "Stay behind me," I said, voice trembling. I hefted the crowbar, though it felt hopeless. The lead ghost, a tall man in a dust-caked suit, raised an arm as if beckoning. I sensed not just malevolence but sorrow. He wanted us to join them in eternal wandering, to fill the empty seats of their lost train. The singing swelled, like a siren's call. My vision blurred with tears. My arms felt heavy. "Don't look at them too long," I reminded Robert in a hoarse whisper. We averted our gazes, focusing on the floor or walls. The ghosts drifted closer, forming a half-circle around us. Flickers of their forms shimmered with each step, occasionally revealing glimpses of old injuries, broken limbs, tattered clothing, a slash across someone's throat. We retreated, step by step, until our backs pressed against the locomotive's sealed door. No escape. Just when I thought we were done for, the overhead speaker crackled. Danny's voice, "Brace yourselves. I'm going to try a manual bypass on the ignition. If this works, we might jolt forward." I grabbed the radio. "Do it." The ghosts hissed, as if sensing the plan. They surged forward, hands outstretched. The singing crescendoed, a dreadful harmony that threatened to drown our minds. Robert moaned, starting to slump. I yanked him upright, adrenaline flaring. "I will not let them take us." A deafening roar shook the entire train. Sparks flew from the conductor panel behind us. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The train lurched violently, nearly knocking us off our feet. The ghostly figures wailed, their shapes jittering in the strobing light. Then the locomotive's power flooded back, headlights piercing the night. Our wheels found traction on the rails. We moved. In the swirl of confusion, the ghostly choir broke, scattering like mist on the wind. I glimpsed the tall man's face twisted in anguish as he dissolved into fractals of shimmering light. We gained speed, the momentum shoving me against the wall. Robert braced himself, eyes wide. The door behind us rattled. Freed from that stasis, the train accelerated, pushing forward into the Mojave's black emptiness. It took some minutes to steady ourselves, hearts hammering. Danny's voice came over the speaker again, triumphant but shaken. "We're back. Instruments are stable. Let's get the hell out of this corridor." We traveled another hour, no ghosts in sight. The desert was quiet except for the locomotive's rumble. Gradually, the tension in my chest loosened. I kept a wary eye on the corridors, but saw no flickers. Robert slumped in a seat, burying his face in his hands, exhausted and terrified. I patted his shoulder. By dawn, we reached a small depot near the state line. The rising sun bathed everything in golden light, the desert revealing itself as a field of dusty tans and scraggly brush, innocent under day's glare. We offloaded cargo as planned, though no one felt normal about it. The yard workers gave us odd looks, but we offered no explanation. I discovered the logbook had vanished from my pack. Maybe lost in the chaos. Or maybe the ghosts had claimed it. Either way, I had no proof for the nightmares we'd endured. Just the raw memory of singing voices and ethereal silhouettes. We parted ways after that run. The railroad assigned me a different route, far from the Mojave. Robert left the company altogether. Danny took a leave of absence, citing stress. None of us wanted to speak of that night. We never reported it officially. The railroad would dismiss it as hysteria or sabotage. Or worse, brand us incompetent. Yet the memory lingers. At night, sometimes, I wake in a sweat, dreaming of that cargo car. The eyes that stared at me through the gloom. The tune that echoed from no living throat. I can still feel the hush of the desert and that invisible line where reality frayed. I wonder if the ghosts still ride those rails, searching for unsuspecting trains to board. Perhaps the Mojave's old tragedies remain etched in the desert's bones, replaying forever under the starlight. Maybe next time, they'll succeed in luring some poor soul off the train, or possess the entire convoy. The thought keeps me up at night. Whenever I pass near that region, a chill creeps down my spine. Sometimes, a snippet of that ghostly melody echoes in my mind, unbidden. And I recall the final words from the logbook, as if the old caretaker were whispering them in my ear. Don't ever look too long at them. They will keep you if they can. A year after the incident, on a whim, I visited an archive in a small local museum near Mojave. Searching old newspapers, I discovered an article from 1890 describing a freight derailment that killed multiple workers. The article claimed some bodies were never recovered, lost in a hidden wash, or buried by a sandstorm. Another piece from 1907 referenced sightings of phantom trains crossing the desert at night. The pattern repeated through decades, each witness describing eerie singing and silhouettes in old-time clothing. The museum clerk rolled her eyes at me, calling these stories folk tales. But I knew better. I still ride trains for a living, just not through that particular route. My new run takes me along the coast, far from the Mojave's haunted sands. Yet part of me wonders if the ghosts can roam beyond their cursed corridor. The lines all connect eventually, branching across the country. Could a fragment of that haunting stow away, following the rails? Some nights, alone in a motel, I'll hear the faint rattle of trains on distant tracks, and for a fleeting moment, I fear they've come for me. Then I remind myself, I escaped. I didn't stare too long. They didn't keep me. But the relief is fragile. One misstep, one moment of weakness, could bring them back. If you ever find yourself traveling through the Mojave by rail, heed these words. The desert is a place of extremes, where the line between life and death blurs. Where lost souls might wander, seeking new companions for their eternal journey. If you hear singing in the night, if you see a swirl of figures perched in a supposedly empty freight car, do not look them in the eye. Do not linger. And whatever you do, never step off the train. Because out in that vast wilderness, with the cold moon shining on ancient sands, the boundary between our world and theirs is perilously thin. They want you to look, to follow, to become part of their legion of wandering spirits. Resist them. Steel your nerves. Keep your gaze forward and your mind on the living. Sometimes, I imagine that lost group of ghosts, forever haunting the rails. A spectral choir, moaning their lament for a life cut short, for a desert that devoured them without pity. They reappear whenever a train dares cross that old line, eager to share their sorrow, to trap a new audience in their never-ending twilight. I wonder if, on a quiet night, they gather in car number 14 or whichever wagon is unlucky enough to align with their cursed domain, singing softly to the desert wind. Perhaps they see us as intruders or as potential saviors. Or maybe they simply cling to us out of lonely despair, hoping we'll share their fate so they can finally rest. We'll never know. The Mojave keeps its secrets well. All I can do is pass along this warning, in hopes that someone reading might avoid the same encounter. Because once you hear that unearthly choir, once you sense those eyes upon you, it's already too late to pretend ignorance. And so, the next time you see a freight train slicing across the desert night, spare a thought for the possibility that not all aboard are living. And if you hear a soft melody on the wind, a lullaby no mortal throat should sing, be sure to look away quickly. Because the ghosts of the Mojave might just be waiting to keep you, forever. Story number 3. The Ghosts of Horseshoe Curve. I've always considered winter nights on the Pennsylvania rails to be a strange blend of beauty and dread. There's something hypnotic about the swirling snow illuminated by the train's headlights, and something ominous in the shadows beyond that glow. When I signed on to run the night shift near Horseshoe Curve, a marvel of engineering known for its sweeping bend and sweeping tragedies, I never expected I'd come face to face with what lurked at its edges. They say that stretch of track is haunted by the spirits of workers who died building it, or by passengers from the wrecks that happened there over the past century. I'd always rolled my eyes at ghost stories. But on a certain December night, under a sky thick with snow and secrets, I learned how quickly doubt can turn to belief. We call the train Midnight Steel, a moniker ironically comforting, as though naming it would tame the creeping sense that the track at night had a mind of its own. It's a relatively modern locomotive, powerful enough to haul freight cars through the Allegheny Mountains. My crew was small, just me, an assistant engineer named Mason, and a conductor, Rhonda, who'd watch the monitors and track signals from the rear. Usually, the three of us kept each other awake with casual chatter. But that night, a hush lay over us from the start, as if the cold pressed against the windows wanting in. The Pennsylvania landscape fled past under layers of ice and shadow. The horseshoe curve loomed ahead on the route schedule, a notorious segment of track that curled around a valley. My father used to speak of it with reverence, how it was built at a time when men risked their lives daily, chipping away at rock and earth. We'd be approaching it around midnight, a time when the line between reality and dream can blur. Mason fiddled with dials at the control console, occasionally glancing at me. "You okay, boss? You've been quiet." I forced a grin. Just feeling the chill. And maybe something else, a tingle at the base of my neck. Rhonda's voice crackled over the intercom from the rear car. "All readings normal, folks. Just keep her steady." She sounded calm, but I sensed tension in her tone, as if she too felt the night's peculiar weight. None of us knew how quickly that calm would fracture. As we neared Horseshoe Curve, the snowfall thickened, big white flakes swirling in the headlights. The rails curved gracefully to the left, hugging the hillside. I eased back on the throttle, ensuring we took the turn at a safe speed. The locomotive's rumble vibrated through my bones. Then, out of the swirling white, something caught my eye, a figure on the tracks, standing motionless. A jolt of alarm shot through me. "Mason, someone's on the line." He squinted through the windshield. "I see it too. Looks like multiple people." My heart thumped. Indeed, as we drew closer, 2, 3, maybe half a dozen dark shapes stood along the track's curve, arms raised as if signaling us. Panicked or beckoning, I couldn't tell. They were clad in old-fashioned coats, the type you might see in antique photos. The sight was so unreal, I momentarily thought it was a trick of the snow. Instinct kicked in. I slammed the brake, the locomotive screeching, metal wheels struggling for traction on snow-lubricated steel. Sparks flew. My breath caught. I prayed these people would step aside. But they didn't move. They only stared, silent, arms outstretched. We ground to a halt, the engine panting like a cornered animal, steam mixing with winter air. The figures were gone. Just gone, as if they'd never been. Snow and darkness filled the space where they had stood. Mason exhaled shakily. "What the hell?" Sweat beaded on my brow, despite the cold. My mind reeled. I flipped on the external floodlights, scanning the curve. The beams revealed only swirling snow, the rocky hillside, ghostly trees. No footprints, no sign of life. Rhonda's voice buzzed through the speaker, anxious. "Everything all right up there?" We stopped pretty hard. I swallowed, pressed the intercom. "Saw people on the track. They vanished." "You see anything on the cameras?" A pause. "No. The feed's just static from the storm." My hands trembled on the throttle as I nudged the locomotive forward. The train groaned, inching through the curve. Our headlights sliced through the falling snow, revealing only emptiness. No one stood on the rails. No footprints marred the fresh powder. After we cleared the curve, I exhaled. Mason's face was pale. "Could be illusions," he whispered. "Light playing on the snow." But we both knew illusions rarely cause a half-dozen distinct silhouettes, each with the same pleading posture. Something was off. I forced a chuckle. "We'll note it in the log. Keep an eye out." We pressed on. The tension in the cab was thick enough to taste, my chest tight with adrenaline. Outside, the storm worsened, wind howling. The wheels clacked ominously, as though the rails themselves disapproved of our passage. Maybe an hour later, we reached a straightaway. I relaxed slightly, letting the engine pick up speed. Mason took the chance to duck to the back for coffee, leaving me alone with the dials and the swirl of white outside. Then the radio crackled. "Hey, boss," came Rhonda's voice from the rear. "I'm picking up a strange sound in the cargo car. Like moaning or something." I stiffened. "Is the cargo shifting?" "Doesn't sound mechanical," she replied, voice hushed. "More like voices?" "I can't be sure. The feed is staticky." My pulse quickened. "Stay put. I'll come back there." I left the controls on autopilot for a moment, risky, but we had a smooth stretch, and hurried through the locomotive door into the first cargo car. The frigid air slapped me. Each step echoed across the metal floor. I found Rhonda in the small monitoring booth. She looked spooked, gesturing at the screen. It displayed a shaky camera view of the cargo car behind us, loaded with crates. The built-in mic captured faint groans or sobs, barely audible. Snow hammered the car's roof, adding a muffled roar. We exchanged alarmed looks. "No one's in there, right?" she asked. "Shouldn't be. It's just freight." I pressed a button to speak through the car's intercom. "Hello? Anyone there?" Only static replied, though the moaning continued. Then, abruptly, it ceased. The camera glitched, lines of distortion crossing the screen. By the time it cleared, the cargo car was as still as a tomb. "Could be the wind," I muttered unconvincingly. Rhonda didn't look convinced either. We returned to the cab, each of us uneasy. The train rattled on through the storm. Another hour passed, and the lights on the console flickered. The engine sputtered, as though choking on something intangible. Mason frowned. "Something's messing with the electronics. Could be ice buildup on the overhead lines or track signals." Then we saw it, a dark shape rising out of the snow-blown night. A small station or depot, old and battered, materialized beside the tracks. But we had no scheduled stop here. In fact, none of us recognized it from the route maps. "Impossible," Mason breathed, checking the map. "There's no station in this area anymore. They tore them all down decades ago." Yet there it stood, a weathered station building with a single platform half buried in snow, a flickering lantern shining through a frosted window. The strangest part? The signal on the platform was green, indicating we should stop. The train responded of its own accord. Or maybe I was compelled. My hands moved to the brake, gently slowing us. "We can't just," Rhonda began, but the impulse was irresistible. We eased to a halt outside the station, the headlight revealing a sign overhead, rusted and unreadable. Through the swirling snow, I glimpsed footprints leading from the track to the building. Recent footprints. My heart hammered. "We should check if someone needs help," I managed. It felt like a compulsion, an insane curiosity. Mason and Rhonda stayed behind, so I stepped from the locomotive alone, boots sinking into fresh powder. The wind blasted my face. Each breath stung. I trudged toward the station, flashlight slicing through the gloom. The footprints in the snow were shallow, leading to a warped door. The station sign above was missing letters, but if I squinted, I could make out HSSH, CVE station. My stomach twisted. Horseshoe Curve Station? That station was decommissioned 50, 60 years ago. Yet here it stood. I tried the door. It opened with a groan. Inside, the air was musty, tinged with the scent of decaying wood. The station's waiting area was small, benches lining the walls, an old ticket window boarded up. A single oil lantern flickered on a table, providing a feeble circle of light. My flashlight beam revealed more footprints crossing the dusty floor, vanishing behind a splintered partition. A noise made me whirl around, a faint shuffle, like someone shifting position. I advanced, heart pounding, peering behind the partition. At first, I saw nothing but gloom. Then a shape emerged from the darkness, a young man in tattered clothes, face gaunt, eyes brimming with sorrow. He gazed at me, lips parted, as if wanting to speak. My body froze. Every fiber screamed impossible. He wore a style of clothing from a century past, high-collared shirt, suspenders. And where his feet should have cast a shadow, there was nothing. His eyes flicked to my flashlight, then to me. He raised a trembling hand, pointing behind me. I spun around, but the station was empty. Then I heard a whisper, carried by the wind through a broken window, "Don't leave, we need help, help us." I staggered back. The young man had vanished. My flashlight flickered. The lantern's flame dimmed. "Get out," my mind screamed. But curiosity and terror held me in place. Suddenly, the entire station seemed to hum with unseen energy. The boarded windows rattled, a draft swirling. Faint voices rose in a discordant chorus. Memories of the illusions we'd seen on the track flooded my mind. These were the ghosts of that old horseshoe curve accident or some subsequent tragedy. Could they be the same apparitions we saw earlier? Down the corridor behind the ticket booth, I glimpsed movement, multiple shadows crossing. The patter of footsteps drew closer. It felt like a crowd was converging. My heart hammered like a drum. They want me to join them, the old stories whispered in my memory. A wave of dread nearly made me collapse. A voice behind me, calm, but firm, "You can't stay here." I turned. Another figure stood in the doorway, a rail worker, older, mustached, wearing a uniform from the early 1900s, complete with brass buttons and a wide-brimmed cap. His eyes flickered with unnatural light. He raised his hand in a silent command that said, "Go." The voices around us swelled, as if protesting. He stood his ground, the station's gloom swirling around him. Then, unbelievably, he turned, hooking his gaze into mine. "Leave," he mouthed. I bolted. Tearing out of the station, I tripped over the threshold and sprawled in the snow. Mason had come looking for me, shining a flashlight from the train steps. "Hey! Over here," he hollered. I scrambled up, stumbling toward him. The bizarre station behind me seemed to flicker in and out of existence under the swirling snow. As I neared the locomotive, Rhonda opened the hatch. "Get inside, quick," she yelled, voice taut with fear. Inside, I slammed the door shut, panting. Mason seized my shoulders. "What did you find?" "A ghost, a station that shouldn't exist," my words tumbled out. "They tried to keep me there." I rummaged for the throttle. "We have to go now." Rhonda's eyes were wide, knuckles white on the seat's edge. "The route's blocked on the map display, though." "We're not on the main line?" My blood ran cold. I checked the console. The screen displayed an error, the track alignment reading incorrect, as if the rails had changed under us. Outside, the ghostly station still flickered in the snow. The faint silhouette of that young man's face hovered at a window, staring. "No," Mason hissed. "We just have to push forward." I yanked on the lever. The locomotive roared, wheels slipping momentarily. But nothing moved. We were stuck, like the train had sunk into quicksand, or the rails themselves had vanished. Panic hammered in my chest. Then the station lights across the way flared, brightening unnaturally. Shadowy forms spilled out onto the platform, men, women, children, all wearing old-time clothes, faces slack with sorrow. They reached out, beckoning. Some stepped into the snow, starting toward us. "Oh, God," Rhonda whispered. Summoning every ounce of will, I twisted the brake release. The train lurched, screaming metal. "Come on, come on." Snow pelted the windows. The engine whined. The ghosts drew nearer, arms extended. Through the windshield, I saw their eyes glowing in the swirling snow, a silent plea or demand. Suddenly, with a jolt, the train's traction caught. The locomotive jerked forward a foot, then another. A thunderous groan rattled the cabin. The ghosts halted as if they sensed their grip slipping. Some parted their lips, a silent wail forming. The young man from the station stood among them, expression heartbreakingly sad. He mouthed a single word, "Wait." But I didn't. The engine roared. Sparks flew from the wheels. We inched forward, faster, faster. The station lights dimmed, flickering out. The shapes in the snow blurred. Then, like a mirage dissolving in desert heat, the entire station vanished into the blizzard. The rails realigned beneath us, control panels readjusted. We were on the main track again, the route to Pittsburgh or beyond. The night lay silent except for the hiss of the wind. We eventually emerged from the storm into a pale dawn, the horizon aglow with a winter sunrise. The train's engine purred normally, as though the previous hours were a bad dream. The terror-laden tension lingered among us, unspoken. Mason, Rhonda, and I exchanged shell-shocked glances, but said little, each wrestling with the impossibility of what we'd experienced. At the next yard, we disembarked, stiff-limbed and hollow-eyed. The railway supervisor asked why we were late, demanded a report. We gave a sanitized version about heavy snow and track confusion. No mention of ghosts or vanished stations. They'd think we'd gone mad. But we knew the truth. That something out there, near Horseshoe Curve, calls to unsuspecting trains at night, weaving illusions of a station lost in time. A legion of restless souls waiting for new passengers to share their eternal limbo. Another inch, another moment of hesitation, and we might have joined them. Months later, sometimes I wake at night drenched in sweat, hearing that faint melodic moan. I see the young man's pleading face. I can't forget his eyes, or the hush of that spectral station. I still ride trains for a living, but whenever I pass near Horseshoe Curve, my heart pounds. The dead still walk those rails. They say history haunts the living in subtle ways. But in Pennsylvania's winter nights, near that storied curve, the haunting isn't subtle. It's real, a ripple in time that can snare the unwary. If you find yourself traveling that route on a snow-laden midnight, keep your eyes forward. Don't heed any phantom signals or stations not on the map. Because if you do, the ghosts of Horseshoe Curve might lead you off the rails into a world of perpetual night from which you'll never return. And if you see figures standing along the tracks, arms raised like they need help, remember, some calls for help are meant to lure you into the darkness forever.